Welcome back to Dieu Han RV. Thank you for making time to join us today. We know life can be busy, so your presence here means the world to us. This channel has grown because of your love, your comments, and your support. Every click, every watch, every share, it all matters more than we can say. So please get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's step gently into the next chapter of Dieu Han's journey. By the way, what time is it where you are? And which part of the world are you watching from? Drop us a comment below. We truly read every single one and it means so much to us. We're building a community here, and your voice is part of it. Now, today's episode picks up right where things left off. Dieu Han's world was quiet, but someone unexpected is back. And his arrival may shatter everything she worked so hard to rebuild. Dan didn't knock. He didn't have to. His presence alone cracked the air with an ease. Dieu Han, still inside, had no idea her past was standing at the gate again. Mrs. Ho, surprised but composed, asked him calmly why he had returned. Dan's eyes didn't blink. He simply said he wanted to see if she was okay, but something in his tone hinted this visit wasn't just about concern. Inside the house, Dieu Han was still laughing faintly with Trin. The wind outside had begun to shift, whispering something colder. Mrs. Ho stepped back, unsure if she should call Dieu Han out or shield her. Dan stood quietly, but his silence screamed louder than any knock. He wasn't here just to visit. He came with emotions she thought had long died, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one hiding something. Inside the house, Dieu Han was still laughing faintly with Trin. The wind outside had begun to shift, whispering something colder. Mrs. Ho stepped back, unsure if she should call Dieu Han out or shield her. Dan stood quietly, but his silence screamed louder than any knock. He wasn't here just to visit. He came with emotions she thought had long died, and maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only one hiding something. What happens when two timelines collide? When a woman finally rebuilding peace meets the very storm she escaped? That's what we're about to explore, together. So if you're feeling the tension rise like we are, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dieu Han RV, and hit that bell icon, because trust us, the story is far from over. And in the next chapter, every silence will begin to speak. Dieu Han froze when she saw Dan and Trin exchange smiles, not the awkward kind strangers share. It was familiarity. It was memory. Dan's surprised eyes softened. Trin smirked like he expected this reunion. Dieu Han took a step back, as if watching two old friends reunite, but something in their eyes made her chest tighten. You haven't changed a bit, Trin said, nudging Dan playfully. Dan chuckled. You neither, still full of surprises. Their voices carried the weight of old days, but also a strange tension Dieu Han couldn't place. She looked between them, searching for a sign that this was just normal, but her heart whispered otherwise. Remember that time in Diep? Trin laughed. Dan nodded, grinning. They kept listing memories, things Dieu Han had never heard. Inside, she smiled politely. Outside, she felt like a guest at her own story. Who exactly was Trin to Dan? And why hadn't she ever heard his name before? Dan caught Dieu Han's gaze. There was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. He took a step closer, trying to explain, but Trin spoke first, teasing Dan with another secret tale. Dieu Han looked away. She didn't want to admit the jealousy, but it burned, sharp and silent. What were they hiding? Was it just friendship, or something deeper that Dan never mentioned? Trin was charming, confident, and clearly knew Dan well. Dieu Han's chest tightened. She trusted Dan, but did she know him? As the sun dipped lower, Dieu Han stood there, between two men with shared history. Trin's smile never faded. Dan kept glancing her way, as if wanting to fix something before it cracked. But in her heart, a fracture had already formed, and she didn't know what would come next. Trin leaned closer to Dan, voice low and teasing. There was something theatrical in the way he moved, a tilt of the head to precise, a smile that lingered a beat too long. Dan chuckled nervously, unsure if it was just Trin's flair or something deeper being signaled. Dieu Han, catching the energy shift, quietly stepped away and picked up the rake near the fence. Trin casually rested a hand on Dan's shoulder, his fingers brushing longer than necessary. Dan tensed slightly but didn't move away. He glanced toward the garden where Dieu Han was. She had her back turned, pulling weeds, but something in her stillness spoke volumes. It wasn't ignorance, it was restraint. She was giving them space. And Dan felt the weight of that choice. "You always act so straight," Trin joked. His words dipped in ambiguity. Dan offered a half laugh, but couldn't shake the knees in his chest. It wasn't like the past. Something about Trin felt bolder, as if testing waters that should stay still. Meanwhile, Dieu Han kept digging, her hands rough with dirt and emotion. Dan sat down on the stone bench. Trin followed, sitting a bit too close. The sun was sharp, but so was the tension between them. "I miss this vibe," Trin said, voice low and loaded. Dan nodded slowly, but he could feel the weight of Dieu Han's silence behind them, even though she made no sound. With every subtle touch, Trin watched Dan's reactions. A brush of the elbow, a joke whispered to close. Dan stayed composed, but his mind was spiraling between confusion and guilt. Should he say something? Should he step back? Meanwhile, Dieu Han wiped her brow, pretending the sun was the only reason she was sweating. Trin leaned back and sighed. Things were easier back then, weren't they? Dan didn't answer. His eyes followed Dieu Han's every move. She was pouring water into a row of plants. But her motions were slower now, like her thoughts weighed her down. Trin noticed too, and smiled. Dan finally stood up, brushing dust off his jeans. He didn't say anything, but the discomfort was obvious in his shoulders. Trin watched him with a look unreadable, a mix of curiosity, challenge, and nostalgia. Behind them, Dieu Han knelt in the soil, hands buried but heart fully aware. This wasn't just about gardening anymore. Dieu Han pressed her hand to her chest, as if calming a storm no one else could see. She had opened her home, her life, to a man she thought she was beginning to understand. Now another stood too close to him, too familiar, and everything she built felt fragile. Too fragile. Dan walked slowly towards Dieu Han, his steps light but purposeful. She looked up from the soil and offered a gentle smile. It wasn't forced, but it wasn't carefree either. He picked up the second hoe lying nearby and began to dig beside her. They worked in silence at first, the rhythm of the tools breaking the stillness. Dieu Han was glad he came, but she couldn't ignore the questions dancing at the edge of her heart. With each strike into the earth, Dan glanced at her from the corner of his eye. There was sweat on her brow, a quiet strength in her stance. Dieu Han sensed his gaze but didn't speak. Was he here out of kindness, or was it guilt, obligation, or something else entirely? She dug deeper, both into the soil and her thoughts, searching for clarity that kept slipping through her hands. Dan finally spoke, breaking the silence with a soft voice. "You've done a lot out here. It's impressive." Dieu Han looked up, blinking away both dust and doubt. "Thank you. There's still more to do." Their eyes met briefly, his filled with something warm and unresolved. Hers, cautious but open, and still, 100 unspoken questions floated in the air between them. A soft breeze rustled the nearby leaves, as if trying to lighten the moment. Dan adjusted his grip on the hoe and continued working, stealing quiet glances when he thought she wasn't looking. Dieu Han noticed, not just the glances, but the hesitation behind them. He wanted to say more. So did she, but both feared what truth might come out. There was comfort in the shared silence, but also a quiet ache beneath it. Dieu Han's thoughts swirled. Why now? Why come back like this, right when her heart was starting to settle again? She didn't want to reopen old wounds, but here he was, cupping dirt in his hands, standing beside her like before. Dieu Han stepped into the house to fetch cold water, leaving the quiet warmth of the garden behind. The sound of tools and light conversation faded as she closed the door. Outside, Trin had just walked toward Dan with a relaxed smile. He picked up the spare hoe without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for the chance to join in. The soil was soft, the morning breeze forgiving, but the real digging was happening between two hearts. Dan looked over at Trin, surprised but not unwelcome. "Didn't expect you to jump in," he said with a smirk. Trin laughed, swinging the hoe gently into the soil. "I'm full of surprises." The two men settled into a natural rhythm, tools hitting earth in steady beats. They didn't need to say much at first, but a certain ease grew between them, like old friends catching up under an open sky. "So," Trin began, glancing sideways, "you and Dieu Han close," Dan chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "We were something a long time ago." Trin nodded, though his grip tightened slightly. "I see. She's strong, but looks like she still keeps memories buried." The air grew a little heavier, but Dan just smiled and continued digging. "There's a lot to admire in her," he said simply. Trin paused, looking at Dan more closely. He wasn't just some forgotten flame. There was still care in his voice, and something instead in his eyes. "You planning to stay long?" Trin asked, voice light but sharp. Dan didn't answer right away. He leaned into his work, then finally said, "As long as I'm needed, I'll be around." The answer stirred something Trin wasn't ready to name. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across their shoulders. Their hands worked in sync, the earth between them loosening with every stroke. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. There was challenge in Trin's smile, curiosity in Dan's gaze. Both were building something more than a garden bed that day. Inside the house, Dieu Han poured water into 3 glasses, her ears faintly catching the hum of conversation outside. She hesitated, wondering what kind of bond was growing between the two men. Was it friendship, or something far more complicated? She wasn't sure whether to smile or worry. As the glasses clanked together, a strange knot formed in her chest. Trin tossed a playful grin toward Dan, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're not so bad with a hoe," he teased. Dan laughed, tossing a clump of weeds aside. "Don't underestimate city boys." They both laughed, the tension easing slightly. In that moment, they were just 2 men, sweating under the sun, unaware that Dieu Han was watching from the doorway. Dieu Han stepped outside with a tray of glasses, her expression calm but eyes watchful. The sun hit her shoulders as she crossed the short path to the garden. Trin looked up first, flashing a wide grin. "You're a lifesaver," he said, taking the glass she handed him. She smiled back politely, watching him gulp the water like he hadn't drunk in days. Something in his tone made her stomach tighten slightly. "Hot day, huh?" Trin added with a wink, his fingers brushing hers too long as he returned the glass. Dieu Han pulled her hand back instinctively, still smiling but now stiffly. She gave a soft nod and turned toward Dan, who had been watching silently. His eyes flicked between Trin's hand and Han's face, reading the small tension like it was written in bold. Dan stood up as she approached, brushing dirt from his palms before accepting the glass. "Thanks, Han," he said quietly. There was something in his voice that made her heart pause. The way he said her name, it still held warmth, like nothing had changed. She nodded slightly, eyes lingering on his face longer than she meant to. Trin watched them from behind, expression unreadable. For a brief moment, the 3 of them stood in a triangle, silent except for the wind and the creak of old bamboo fences. Dieu Han felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She wasn't sure what had shifted, but something had. These weren't just friendly gestures. There were lines being drawn here, and she was standing right in the middle of them. She stepped back, collecting the empty glasses without another word. Her smile had faded into something softer, a little sad, a little distant. Dan opened his mouth, as if to say something, but stopped himself. Trin leaned on the hoe, eyes not leaving Dieu Han's back as she walked away. The silence that followed was louder than any confession. As Trin and Dan continued to till the soil under the morning sun, Dieu Han quietly stepped back into the house to prepare lunch. She glanced out the window once, watching the 2 men working in awkward silence. Suddenly, the sound of a motorbike echoed from the road. Then arrived, his face calm but purposeful. He parked near the front gate, full strapped to the back of his bike. He was here to fix what time and life had broken. Trin's eyes lit up the moment he saw Then. Without hesitation, he rushed forward and gave him a warm, almost too long hug. Dan stood frozen, confused by their closeness. Dieu Han, still in the kitchen, was unaware of the silent storm brewing outside. Then looked surprised, but smiled politely, his eyes darting between Trin's excitement and Dan's furrowed brows. Something felt off. This wasn't just a friendly greeting. This was a show. But for whom? Dan's heart sank as Trin playfully touched Dan's arm, laughing at something only the two of them seemed to understand. It was too smooth, too familiar. Dan clenched the shovel tighter in his hand, feeling a storm of questions rising in his chest. Who was this man to Trin, and what was this connection between them? Dieu Han had invited him here, but suddenly, he felt like the outsider in a game he didn't know he was part of. Then tried to keep things casual, but Trin's subtle touches and lingering glances didn't go unnoticed. Dan watched in silence, his smile fading with every passing second. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. He came here to help rebuild a home, but instead found himself standing in the middle of a triangle he didn't ask for. And Dieu Han, unaware of the storm outside, was still cooking, for three hearts already colliding. What did you just witness? A spark between Trin and Then, storm brewing in Dan's eyes, and Dieu Han walking toward a truth she's not ready for. Is this just friendship or a dangerous triangle of secrets? Whose heart will break first? Comment your theories below. We're watching them all. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next twist in the story.